My name is Margaret Hill. I was 46 years old when my heart failed. Not metaphorically. Not dramatically. Literally, on a Tuesday afternoon in November, my chest caved in like a building losing its foundation, and an ambulance rushed me to the nearest hospital while I was still conscious enough to be terrified. The doctors used words like critical and immediate and do not wait. They told me I needed emergency surgery. They told me the window was small. And in that cold, bright hospital room, with an 4 in my arm and a monitor beeping beside my head, I did what any person does when the ground falls away beneath them. I reached for the people who were supposed to catch me. I called my parents. They answered on the third ring. They sounded irritated. They said they were busy and could not deal with drama right now. Then the line went dead. The nurse looked at me and asked, quietly, who else could sign if they did not come? Thank you for listening to my story. I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop a comment below. If this story resonated with you, please subscribe, like, and hit the bell so you never miss the next one. Every share helps these stories reach someone who needs to hear them. Let's keep the conversation going. They wheeled me into the operating room alone. There was no hand to hold in the hallway. No familiar face in the waiting room. No one pacing outside the double doors with a paper cup of cold coffee, praying. Just nurses in blue scrubs, the squeak of wheels on linoleum, and the overhead lights sliding past me like slow white moons. I signed everything I could before they put me under. My hand shook on the paperwork. The anesthesiologist spoke to me in a low, calm voice, but I barely heard the words. All I could hear was the sound of my mother hanging up. All I could feel was the strange, hollow understanding that I had spent 46 years putting those two people first. Every holiday, every crisis, every inconvenient phone call, and now, in the one moment I needed them completely, they had decided I was too much trouble. The anesthesia pulled me under. Somewhere in the middle of the surgery, my heart stopped. I woke up in the recovery room. The ceiling was white. The machines beeped steadily. I was alive, which surprised me more than it probably should have. I lay there for a long time before I turned my head and looked at the chair beside my bed. It was empty. I looked at the windowsill. No flowers. No balloons. No handwritten card propped against a water cup. I listened for familiar voices in the hallway. There were none. The nurses were kind but careful around me, the way people are when they know something painful and do not want to be the one to say it. I was in that room for 2 more days before I overheard 2 of them talking softly near the door. My parents had been contacted multiple times by the hospital. Contacted and given updates. Contacted and offered information about visiting hours and post-operative care. They had declined each time. I reached for my phone with the arm that did not have a needle in it. There was 1 voicemail and 2 text messages. The voicemail was from my mother. Her voice was flat and slightly annoyed, the tone she used when she felt she was being made to feel guilty about something she had already decided was not her fault. She said I always exaggerated. She said they were not going to rearrange their entire lives for another one of my scares. She said she was sure I would be fine. The texts were from my father. The first said they figured I would pull through like always. The second said to let them know when I was back home. I read both messages twice. Then I set the phone down on the blanket beside me and looked at the ceiling again. Something happened in that moment that I did not fully understand until much later. It was not rage. It was not grief exactly. It was more like a door closing. Quietly, firmly, and permanently. A social worker knocked and stepped into my room. The social worker's name was Anne. She was practical and kind and got straight to the point. She explained that the hospital had attempted to reach my listed emergency contacts, my parents, regarding post-operative care arrangements and financial responsibility. Both had declined involvement. The hospital needed a discharge plan. They needed to know where I would go, who would help me, and how I would manage the first weeks of recovery. I was not supposed to climb stairs. I was not supposed to lift anything. I was not supposed to be alone for extended periods. And had a folder of options: rehab facilities, home care services, transitional housing. She went through them carefully while I sat in my hospital bed with a fresh scar on my chest and the slow, clear understanding that I had been erased. Not by strangers. By the 2 people whose names I had carried since birth. I was discharged 3 days earlier than recommended because there was nowhere to place me quickly enough. I recovered in a rented room in a house owned by a woman named June, who had 2 cats and a habit of leaving soup outside my door without knocking. I had known June through a mutual friend for years, and she offered the room without hesitation when I told her what happened. I did not tell her everything. I told her enough. The stairs were hard for the first 3 weeks. I held the railing with both hands and took them one at a time, resting at the landing. My friends, not many but real, came in shifts. They brought groceries and sat with me and did not make me talk when I did not want to. About a month after I was discharged, I finally called my parents. I wanted to hear them say something, anything that made it make sense. Instead, my mother told me I was weaponizing my illness to make them feel guilty. I hung up. I did not call again. 5 years passed. That sounds like a long sentence, and it was. But it did not feel slow. It felt like rebuilding, which is a different kind of work than most people imagine. I changed my will. My parents had been listed as secondary beneficiaries. I removed them and replaced them with 2 people who had actually shown up. I changed my emergency contacts. I changed my medical proxy. I sat with a lawyer for 2 hours one afternoon and carefully, legally, quietly restructured every document that had once assumed my parents were part of my safety. Then I restructured myself. Not overnight. Not dramatically. I started saying no to things that cost me more than they gave me. I started sleeping better. I started understanding that love without reliability is not love. It is just the idea of love, which is a much colder thing to hold. And then, almost by accident, an opportunity appeared. A former colleague named Brenda reached out about a position she thought I might be right for. It was in healthcare administration, a behind-the-scenes role focused on patient advocacy and care planning for aging adults. The organization helps seniors navigate insurance systems, estate planning, and long-term care options. It was steady work. Purposeful work. I had spent enough time on the wrong side of a hospital discharge to understand exactly what these people needed and exactly how frightening it was to face those systems without support. I took the job. I was good at it. I moved up gradually, took on more responsibility, and found something I had not expected to find in a spreadsheet and a case file, meaning. I was helping people avoid the kind of abandonment I had experienced. I was making sure no one sat in a recovery room alone if I could help it. Then, about 3 years into the role, 2 familiar names crossed my desk. I want to be precise here, because the details matter. My parents' names appeared not through any action I took, but through the ordinary overlap of a city where networks connect and systems share data with appropriate permissions. They had been entered into several care planning databases, connected to programs my organization worked alongside. I was not their caseworker. I was not involved in their specific files. But I saw enough to understand the shape of their situation. They were aging in the way people do when they have spent decades assuming someone else will handle the hard parts. Their paperwork was incomplete. Their planning was thin. The safety net they believed they had built was full of gaps they had not noticed yet. I quietly recused myself from anything touching their cases directly. It was the professional and ethical thing to do. But I could see the gaps. And I understood, without any satisfaction, that the gaps were real. I found out through a distant relative who mentioned it without thinking that my parents had quietly removed me from their will some years back. Apparently, they had been concerned I might make future financial claims related to my medical situation, as if my emergency surgery had been a scheme to inconvenience them. I sat with that information for a day. I turned it over. I waited to feel something sharp and it never came. What came instead was clarity. The same kind you feel when a room you have been squinting through finally gets proper light. I had spent years operating under some faint remaining hope that I had misread them, that the hospital had been a terrible aberration and not a true reflection of who they were. That hope finished quietly when I heard about the will. That same week, I updated my own estate plan again. I added a charitable bequest. I felt, for the first time, genuinely free. My father's heart began to fail when he was 71. The condition was serious but not immediately fatal, the kind of diagnosis that reshapes daily life permanently rather than ending it quickly. He needed medication management, regular monitoring, dietary changes, and careful oversight of his activity. My mother, who was 69 and managing her own slow accumulation of age-related health issues, became his primary caregiver. It was too much for one person. They had not planned for this. They had not set aside enough. They had assumed, the way people sometimes do, that the future would arrange itself kindly. The savings moved faster than they expected. The logistics were harder than they imagined. Caregiving at that scale is exhausting in ways that cannot be understood until you are inside it. They began to struggle visibly. And then, after nearly 4 years of complete silence, my mother's name appeared on my phone screen. I stared at it for a long moment before I answered. She was crying before she finished saying my name. Her voice had aged, thinner than I remembered, less certain of itself. She said she missed me. She said things had gotten very hard. She said they needed family around them, that my father was not well, that she could not do everything alone. I listened to all of it without interrupting. I did not raise my voice. I did not list every wrong thing they had done. I simply let her finish, and then I told her, carefully and honestly, that I was not able to provide direct care or financial assistance. I told her I could share resources, numbers, programs, referrals to services designed exactly for their situation. I said I would send her a list by the end of the week. She went quiet. Then her voice shifted, not sad anymore, but offended. She said she had not expected me to be cold. She said she thought family meant more than a list of phone numbers. I sent the resources anyway. Everything publicly available and relevant to their situation. Senior care programs, caregiver support networks, insurance assistance lines, local services for aging adults with medical needs. I organized it clearly. I sent it with a brief, warm note explaining what each item was and how to access it. I did not send money. I did not offer to take over logistics. I did not agree to become the person who managed their lives. My mother called twice more that week. The second time, she told me I had become a cold and unfeeling person, and she did not recognize me. I told her, gently and without cruelty, that I remembered a Tuesday in November when I was 46 years old and my heart stopped on an operating table, and the chair beside my recovery bed was empty. She said that was in the past. I said yes. It was. My father did not call at all for 3 months after that. Then he stopped reaching out entirely for almost a year. Over the following 12 months, I heard pieces of their situation through my aunt, who lived nearby and kept me loosely informed without taking sides. The picture was not dramatic. It was just the slow accumulation of unattended problems. Insurance paperwork missed by days, disqualifying them from a program they needed. A care referral that got lost because no one followed up. A medication management issue that led to a preventable hospital visit. My father's condition required more oversight than my mother could provide alone, and the professional support they had delayed arranging was now urgent and expensive. None of it was the result of anything I did or did not do. It was simply what happens when planning is treated as optional until it is not. They had navigated life believing that need, when it arrived, would summon help automatically. Need does not work that way. Then one evening in the 5th year after my surgery, someone knocked at my door. It was after 8 o'clock. I was reading in the living room, a cup of tea on the table beside me. The knock was hesitant, not urgent, but not casual either. I opened the door and found my parents standing on my porch in the November dark. My mother looked smaller. My father stood slightly behind her, his color off, his posture careful in the way of someone managing pain. They were both older in ways that went beyond years. My mother's eyes were red. My father would not quite meet mine. I stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at them, two people I had loved my whole life, who had failed me completely at the moment I needed them most, who were now standing on my porch asking to be let in. I felt many things at once. I did not feel triumph. I stepped back and opened the door wider. They came inside. My mother began to cry before she reached the sofa. I made tea. It gave my hands something to do while they settled. My father sat in the armchair near the window. My mother sat on the edge of the sofa, her coat still on, like some part of her was not sure how long she was allowed to stay. They talked for a long time. They talked about how hard the past year had been, about the medical bills, about the exhaustion, about the loneliness of managing something this large without enough help. My mother talked about fear, something she had rarely admitted to when I was growing up. My father talked very little, but when he did, his voice was slower than I remembered, more deliberate. I let them say everything they needed to say without interruption. I did not rush them. I did not argue with their framing or correct their version of events. I waited until they were finished. Then my mother looked at me and asked if I could take over managing their care. I set my cup down. I told them I love them. I want to be clear about that because it matters. Love did not leave, it changed shape. It became something with edges and limits and an understanding of what I could carry without breaking. I told them I was not in a position to take over their care. I explained my own health situation, because my heart, though functioning, required ongoing management and would for the rest of my life. I explained that the kind of caregiving they were describing would put my own health at serious risk. I told them about the boundaries I had built, not as punishment, but as survival. I told them, as plainly as I could, how close I had come to dying alone. My mother looked at me and said, in a voice that was almost gentle, "We didn't think it was that serious." And something in me, something that had been waiting 5 years for that exact sentence, finally, quietly, came to rest. I got up and walked to the small filing cabinet I kept in the hallway. I brought back a folder and sat down across from them. Inside were printed copies of hospital records, the date of admission, the surgery notes, the documentation of the brief cardiac arrest during the procedure, the discharge summary, the social worker's report, which noted in plain clinical language that next of kin had been contacted multiple times and declined to respond, the missed call logs the hospital had forwarded to me months later when I requested my full file. I set them on the table and did not say anything. I watched my parents read. My mother's hand went to her mouth. My father read slowly, turning each page carefully, and when he reached the social worker's note about next of kin declining, he stopped. He set the page down. His shoulders dropped. He covered his face with one hand and sat there for a long time without speaking. That was when I understood that some part of him had not fully believed it until he saw it written down. My father spoke first. He said they had assumed I would always come back, that no matter what happened, I would eventually forgive and return to the way things had always been. He said it the way people confess to something they are not entirely sure was wrong, still half convinced that the logic was sound. My mother said they thought family meant that certain things were always available, that daughters did not actually disappear. I understood, sitting there, that they had not been operating out of pure cruelty. They had been operating out of the assumption that I was bottomless, that I was a resource that renewed itself. That love, in their version of the word, meant I would absorb whatever they gave or did not give and still be there when they needed me. I told them forgiveness was not the same as surrender. I told them I had forgiven them, for my sake, not theirs. But forgiveness did not mean I would hand them unlimited access to what little I had protected. I told them I had one option to offer. Through my work, I had access to professional care planning services, the same services I arranged for strangers every week. I offered to connect them with a qualified care coordinator who would assess their situation, identify the programs they qualified for, and build a realistic plan for managed care going forward. It would involve some cost on their end, though I could help them identify financial assistance for that too. It would not involve me as their primary support. It would not involve my money, my time as a caregiver, or my health. It was exactly what I offered anyone who came to my organization in need: thorough, professional, compassionate, and completely without favoritism. I explained this clearly. My mother asked if I could not simply make some calls on their behalf and handle things informally. I told her no. My father asked if there was any way to speed things up. I told him the process was the process. They sat quietly for a while. They were realizing I would not bend. I watched it settle over them, the understanding that this was not a negotiation, that there was no emotional pressure they could apply, no family obligation they could invoke, no version of guilt that would move me from where I was standing. I was not being cold. I was being exact. I was treating them with the same careful, professional distance they had shown me when I was 46 and frightened and alone on a hospital gurney. Not to punish them. Punishment would have required sustained anger, and I had spent that long ago. But because I had learned, at significant personal cost, that the shape of your boundaries teaches people what you actually believe about yourself. I believed I deserved to be safe. I believed my health mattered. I believed I was allowed to help people without sacrificing myself to do it. My mother looked at me for a long moment. Then she asked, in a small and tired voice, whether I hated them. I told her no. I said it without hesitation because it was true. Hate would have meant they still had control, that their actions had taken up permanent residence in my chest and made a home there. Hate is just love that has curdled and refused to move on. I had not hated them. I had grieved them, which is a different thing entirely, and then I had moved forward. I told my mother that the reason I was able to sit across from them and speak calmly was precisely because I did not hate them. I had chosen peace instead, not as a gift to them, but as a gift to myself. Peace is not passive. It requires more work than anger, more discipline, more willingness to let things remain unresolved at the surface while you tend to what is underneath. My father looked up when I said that. He nodded once slowly and looked back at the table. They left about 20 minutes later. My mother hugged me at the door. I let her. Several weeks after that evening, the care coordinator I had connected them with completed their assessment and helped place them in an assisted living facility they could afford. It was not luxurious. It was clean and safe and staffed by people who knew what they were doing. My aunt told me my parents had described the situation to relatives as losing their daughter. I did not call to correct them. I did not post anything or explain myself to anyone who asked. I understood what they meant. They had lost the version of me that would have absorbed all of this quietly and kept coming back for more. That version of me had not survived the hospital. Something sturdier had taken her place. I sent the assisted living facility a brief professional note through appropriate channels, confirming I was not a care contact but was available for administrative questions only. Then I closed that file and went back to the rest of my work. The letter arrived on a Thursday morning, handwritten in my father's careful block print on plain white paper. It was one page. It did not ask for anything. It did not reference their current situation or make any request about the future. It said only that they were sorry, not for any specific thing, but in the broad and honest way of people who have finally stopped defending themselves long enough to see clearly. My mother had signed it too, her signature below his, slightly unsteady. I read it twice. I set it on the kitchen counter and made breakfast and moved through the rest of the day. I did not respond. Not because I wanted to wound them with my silence, but because there was nothing left to say that would not pull me back into a conversation that had already reached its natural end. That night I lay in my bed in my own home, stable and warm and fully mine, and I slept without waking up once. I stand in my kitchen most mornings now with a cup of coffee and the particular quiet of a life that has been deliberately built. My heart beats steadily, not perfectly, not without maintenance, but steadily. I have a cardiologist I trust and a routine I follow, and a body I have learned to treat with the seriousness it deserves. I have work that means something. I have people around me who have proven, in practical and unglamorous ways, that they will show up. I did not destroy my parents. I did not campaign against them or expose them or arrange for consequences to find them. I simply stopped standing between them and the truth of their own choices. And I stopped pretending that love was a reason to keep absorbing harm. The victory was not loud. There was no moment of standing over someone who had fallen. There was just this, a quiet kitchen, a beating heart, and a life I nearly lost but somehow kept. They ignored my heart when it was failing. I listened to mine when it finally learned to stop begging.